We are very pleased, as all of you know, that this year's Spokane Jewish Film Festival includes Reckonings, which is a film by the acclaimed documentarian Roberta Grossman, who also directed Who Will Write Our History and Above and Beyond. And the latter of those we screened during our 2015 festival 9 years ago. So it all comes full circle now. We're even more pleased, of course, that Karen Heilig, producer of Reckonings and Claims Conference Assistant Executive VP and General Counsel, agreed to take part in a Zoom Q&A, and that our own community's Dr. Mary Noble, who co-founded the Spokane Community Observance of the Holocaust, agreed to serve as Q&A host and moderator. And I'll let Karen and Mary introduce themselves further to whatever extent they wish. In the meantime, a warm welcome to both of you and to anyone who may be viewing this recording in the future. All right, I'll turn it over to you, Mary.
Thanks, Neil. Well, I hope everyone's had an opportunity to watch the film Reckonings. And if you're joining us or watching the recording, before you watch the movie, let me take a moment to give you a bit of background. The movie is focused on the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, commonly known as the Claims Conference. That summary makes it sound like a boring movie, but it's anything but boring. When World War II ended, 2 out of every 3 European Jews had been annihilated, and Germany was in ruins. Germans were polled to identify the main victims of the war, and the Jews were at the bottom of the list. Konrad Adenauer, the first chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany, who had been opposed to Nazism, acknowledged to the Bundestag, the German parliament, that the victims of the Nazi regime deserved moral and material compensation. He was motivated by a moral and political understanding that Germany had to engage with the Jewish community and had to rebuild Germany as a democracy to restore the good name of Germany in the world. Many Jews and leaders in Israel were very opposed to any sort of financial compensation that might in any way be perceived as blood money, as a way of absolving German guilt for the death of their family members. 85% of Israel's gross national product was used to finance the War of Independence in 1948. Israel had a population of 600,000 Jews in the post-war period, and Israel absorbed 700,000 Jewish immigrants, about half from the Muslim world and the other half from Europe. This cost a lot of money. By the end of 1951, the Israeli economy was on the verge of collapse. So this was the background to the work of those who met, often in secret, to negotiate what the Germans called Wiedergutmachung, or making good again, a term rejected by Jews, rather restitution or compensation for material losses, property loss, personal suffering in camps and ghettos. There was no financial compensation for loss of life. Nobody wanted to debate the value of one individual's life versus another's. This film does a beautiful job of addressing the many challenges involved in those early years of negotiations. I should note that the work of the Claims Conference has continued since those early years, and the scope of their work has expanded. We're very fortunate that Karen Heilig is with us to talk about the film and about the work of the Claims Conference. Karen's a producer of the film. She's the Claims Conference Assistant Executive Vice President and General Counsel. She's a child of Holocaust survivors who left corporate law to work with the Claims Conference. Since 1999, she's participated in negotiations between the Claims Conference and the German government, the Austrian government, and negotiations on unpaid Holocaust-era insurance policies. She's the first female representative for the Claims Conference in negotiations. So Karen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Could you tell us more about your background and your role with the Claims Conference? What do you actually do?
Well, as you can tell from my accent, I'm not American, I'm Australian. Just a little bit about my family background. My grandparents and my mother escaped Germany, fled from Berlin, and the only visa that they were able to get at that time was to go to Australia, which let them in. And so they arrived in March 1939, and their friends for their entire life were the other German Jews who were on the boat with them to Australia, and then they ended up speaking German as well as obviously as English. And my father, on the other hand, was from a family from Czechoslovakia. Youth Aliyah had come to his part of Czechoslovakia offering to take children, smuggle them into what was then Palestine. His parents said he was the boy and thought this was what he was doing was dangerous, and they would stay behind with their daughter. And unfortunately, that he survived, and they ended up in the camps, and he ended up going to Israel, and he landed later on in life, ended up in the Haganah. And the irony was he actually ended up looking to see if his family had survived. He went, as most people know, the Czech government trained after the end of the war, gave arms and trained Jews in Israel to fight. And so he went with a group of people from the Haganah to smuggle arms into Israel, and also look to see if his family had survived. So for me, my job at the claims conference, I was a corporate lawyer, which I left. I find it's not work. Someone says, how's your job going? And I always sort of think it's not a job, it's a mission, it's a privilege. And I get to do some small thing to redress what was done and to make the lives of Holocaust survivors better. So it's an innate part of my being, and I'm very privileged to be able to do that, and to work even today in the negotiations. And one of the things I think when you see the film, I just cannot believe how the people who negotiated in 1951-52 did it. Because I personally do it today, 70 years later, and I still feel, they talk in the film of the ghosts of the 6 million and the burden. And I feel that today. So I just can't even imagine what it was like a mere 7 years after the war. We negotiate today with the Ministry of Finance in Germany in a building built by Hermann Goering, right? And apart from perhaps taking down the swastikas and adding some computer cables, the building hasn't been renovated. I mean, it's pretty much the same building. And it's spooky, it's eerie, and I just can't even imagine if that's what I'm feeling now, so far removed. I just cannot even imagine what it was like for those negotiators a mere 7 years later.
As you noted, the film depicts the negotiations in the early days, and the orchestration of it all was pretty amazing. How do you feel like what do you think, how do you think the negotiations are different now, 70 years later? Aside from the fact the building is 70 years older.
I think that it's first of all, it's different, and it's sort of it's the same in some ways. Obviously, it's different now. We go to Germany, we go to Berlin, and those negotiations, obviously, no one would go to Germany then. It was not something that was done. I think that so some things are different. We have a lot of Holocaust survivors on our negotiating team. So, and I think that has stayed. That feeling then of survivors looking at Germans and expressing what happened is very important. So we have that sort of continuity as well. Obviously, this is a different generation. Nearly everybody we negotiate with was not even alive then. And I think that one of the things that also is the same is the sense that you had from the time of responsibility, right? And I think that's very much the concept that Konrad Adenauer had, and I think it's bipartisan. I've been doing this for 25 years, and I think it's across political parties in Germany. There's acceptance of the responsibility that they have. And I think in the film, State Secretary Gatzer, who I worked with, says that they feel responsibility but not guilt. I think there's a difference between the two, and I think that's correct. Some things are the same and some things are different. I mean, obviously, in the film at that stage, there was very much no they didn't shake hands. There was no frivolity or casual conversation. Obviously, those aspects have changed. You know what I mean? It is different, but some of the fundamental principles are the same. I think one of the features of the film that you still see is that very much the statement by President Herzog that, for example, the state of Israel has a good relationship and they're a strong partner. We've even seen that, especially in the terrifying last few months that we've had. But I think President Herzog said there can be no forgiveness. And there's a difference, you know what I mean? There can be a repair and moving forward, but forgiveness wasn't on the table and will never be on the table.
In the early days of the claims conference, the criteria for receiving compensation, I think, was pretty narrow.
Mhm.
I know from my own family experience and from what I've read that that's expanded a lot. I don't know if there are still any living survivors who now qualify for compensation, who haven't already been identified. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the
Right, so
claims does now and how the scope has expanded.
Right. So, well, first of all, the scope was very narrow at the beginning. In the original program in the 50s and 60s was, first of all, was run by the German government, right? You have a program that was that basically finished in 1969. Basically, that program, you had to apply by then. That was the original German program. After the reunification of Germany in 1990, you have the creation of the Article 2 fund for people, for survivors who haven't received any payment to date. It's a pension program, and then it had for people in concentration camps, ghettos, hiding, and false identity, and all these categories. Each single one of them has been expanded over the years. Now, why has it been expanded? And part of it is the Claims Conference insisted to negotiate every year for more and more categories. And some of it is a result of new historical research that's been done since the fall of the war. Archives have been open, information on especially places like Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. A lot of those archives were not available. And the German government, when we have negotiations, they're never based on mere argument. They always have to be based on documentation, historical opinions, demographic information, whatever. And also, in particular, in the last few years, what's been happening of what the Holocaust looked like in North Africa. That was really something that was an unknown area in places like Tunisia, which the Germans did occupy for 6 months, whatever else, and also in Libya. In those places, to some extent in parts of Morocco, that has been really those inclusions of many of those groups has been recent because of new historical material. And so over the years, I think most survivors now who were excluded, all of them would have been eligible today. And and over the last since 1990, I think well over 120,000 survivors have, not all of them alive still, but had been approved for a pension payment. You should also note that the original payment programs in the 1950s and 60s were not open to Jews who lived behind the Iron Curtain, because in the Cold War, we're in the midst of the Cold War, remember, Germany doesn't want funds flowing into the communist side. So so they weren't able, Jews who were living in Hungary, in Ukraine, all these places were not at that stage eligible to receive any payments.
And aside from payments, I know originally, or in the early years, the money, the compensation that went to Israel definitely wasn't all in cash. The movie makes it very clear that a lot of it was in materials and I was going to say materials that they needed, oil or whatever. But since then, it seems, I think the claims conference has negotiated so that there's been funding for Yad Vashem and for other institutions. Is that right?
So basically, in the original agreement, there was two things. The claims conference was given a lump sum payment, right, of 450 million Deutschmarks, and that went for the resettlement outside of Israel of displaced persons all over the world, to help in the resettlement of Holocaust survivors. A certain portion of that went for Holocaust education, documentation, and mainly archival preservation. The claims conference funded in those early years half of the costs of establishing Yad Vashem, and also institutions that became things like the Wiener Library, the reconstructed YIVO, what became the Memorial de Shoah in Paris. So many of those early things, with the focus very much on those early times, let's preserve the evidence. That was very much in many places that. So that was in that initial phase. After 1990, the Claims Conference continued to be involved in Holocaust education. And from the money that the Claims Conference received from the former East Germany for Jewish property after unification. What happens in Germany, in the West, everybody sort of gets their property back in the immediate post-war period. Now, what becomes the Russian zone, they don't believe in anyone has property. They're communists. So, in fact, for even your regular East German non-Jew, their property is nationalized. It's taken away. After unification, there's a law that gives everyone their property back. And for Jews, it said all former Jewish owners can get their property back if it was lost or it was confiscated or forced sale during the Nazi period. However, much of this property is unclaimed because there are no heirs, right? Some German Jews managed to leave, but not everybody. With the proceeds of the unclaimed property, the Claims Conference helps survivors, and it uses money for Holocaust education. And so for many years, the Claims Conference is funding Holocaust education worldwide. Starting about 2 years ago, the Claims Conference received money from the German government for the funding of Holocaust education. One of the things we see from survivors is very much that they want the knowledge of how they and perhaps their family perished or how they suffered, and also the pre-war Jewish world this is extremely important for survivors. And we are seeing at the Claims Conference, you saw many surveys and the unfortunate lack of knowledge, especially amongst younger generations, about the Holocaust. So we really feel that it is in the memory of survivors to educate about the Holocaust. And we feel that this should have a Jewish voice, the voice of survivors. So we very much work with, and we're trying very much to reach young people with, we call with what talks to them. Many traditional Holocaust education is not the way to reach young people. So everything from a film, which is obviously a great medium. We have started also, many institutions we've worked with things from holograms to, we funded last year for the first time a TikTok, I do not have it, but my daughter has it, a TikTok influencer whose grandparent was an Auschwitz survivor, to go with a young guide, a historian, and do 10 one-minute TikToks. Now, but she has millions of followers. She's known, she's not even known for anything. She's known for being dance videos, right? Young Jewish woman who's, very big influencer. But for this, I think we've got to try and be creative in how we reach the young people. And we feel this is important. So we're trying to look at all different ways to promote Holocaust education. And we feel this is and survivors are very supportive of this. They really want this.
So I saw, when I was looking online, I saw a presentation that you were part of in 2022. You talked about the development of educational materials for schools and universities related to the film. Was that completed? And if, how's that been implemented?
Yeah, so there's two different things. First is for universities, for colleges. And we had hundreds of universities and colleges could get the film either by DVD or by streaming. And that was just to see the film. In addition, since then, and schools can still go ahead and do it, we have developed educational materials. We have a 37-minute version of the film. You showed the 74-minute version. Most school classes are 40 minutes. And kids are all, they don't have a long attention span. So there was agreed that 37 minutes was the best way to do it. And then we developed materials for different types of schools. There's one lesson if you just want one lesson. There's lessons if you have more time, and they're all different themes, and you can pick them different. One of them explores, for example, the issue of leadership. What is leadership? And looks at Ben-Gurion and Adenauer as what is a leader. Another one talks about forgiveness and reconciliation. So each of the lessons has a different themes. And there's also one particular lesson, which is called reparations and halakha, Jewish law, which is geared towards Jewish day school, more religious, they may want a different point of entry. So this looks at, and was very interesting, the responses of different rabbis when people said, should I take the money, right? Because people come from different perspectives. So you have to have educational materials that looks at the different audiences. Some of the materials, for example, for a Jewish school, maybe look at it from there's a perspective of Israel nation building. How does this affect Ashkenazi Sephardi Jews of Eastern Europe versus Sephardi Jews in Israel, right? It's a more focused on how the reparations debate what happens in Israel. there's different aspects. The one on German nation building looks at a little bit an extension of the film on denazification. What's really interesting is that what you find is some of these people who apply for compensation under the German programs, they get denied and they appeal at court. And the court is full of these ex-Nazis because the judiciary has not really been properly denazified. So this whole issue, so the educational materials don't just look at the film, but take many aspects of the film to their next steps. And what was interesting is last June, there was the Museum of Jewish Heritage in Battery Park in New York, ran a teacher training for 300 public school teachers. I don't think very few of them were Jewish, right? Public school teachers. They loved it, right? And we had the most interesting conversation. They gave anonymous feedback. And really what was really interesting was the diversity of classes that they wanted to use the materials. They were given all the materials from, some of them wanted to use it in debate classes. Some of them wanted it as an introduction to Black reparations. Some wanted an introduction. The gamut of how they were thinking about the film was really, really fascinating. And we were very happy that so many diverse schools were interested in it.
How do schools access that educational material? If I'm thinking about our schools locally, if anybody.
Right, so I'm happy to give you we have a distributor, Good Docs. I'll send you the exact link, and that's a professional company, and the school can pick either 3 years of streaming or a DVD, whatever the school wants, and they get access automatically to all the curriculum. It's all free, completely free. And they can pick what they want as the best way. Some schools don't have to do the streaming, don't have enough broadband or whatever to support it. So they may want the DVD. So we have both options.
That's great. That's great. Neil mentioned that like Herschel and I are intimately involved with the Spokane Community Observance of the Holocaust. And so we have a Holocaust observance around Yom HaShoah time in the spring every year. And for the last 18, 19 years, we've had, with the goal of Holocaust education for young people, we've had a writing contest for middle and high school students, and more recently for an art contest. And during the pandemic, we created a video with our local public television station of Spokane Voices of the Holocaust, so that with some voices of Spokane Holocaust survivors and some of us next generation, using that as a vehicle to sort of provide some Holocaust education. And, the challenge of teachers is how to fit it into their curriculum when they have, this much time to teach about the Holocaust.
Right. One of the interesting things about the movie, and that I really thought was really, got to thank the amazing talent of Roberta, was really, we really wanted to integrate survivors, because we didn't want to have, this is the voice of, the negotiators. And it was very important for us. And I think, we have 5 amazing survivors in the film. I think, they were fabulous. And I remember we had the premiere just over a year ago, and I remember ringing out, because we did the film, takes a long time to make a movie. So I rang up Helena Weinrach, who's the dancer in the film, whatever else. And I rang her up and I said, and it was towards the end of COVID, it was just over a year ago, and we're having a big premiere in New York, and now she's like 98. Then she was a mere 95 when we filmed her. I said, people deteriorate. Do you want to come? Of course I want to come. Can I bring my dance partner? She comes in this sparkling gown, dances with our Executive Vice President Greg Schneider down the red carpet. We danced. It was just that, they're amazing. And Tova, what the film does, and all these the survivors in the film all have amazing stories. Tova Friedman, who you see, she's the one who was from Tova Mazowiecki, whose whole family was destroyed. She was one of the few children. She was actually taken to a gas chamber, and it malfunctioned. It was one of the 2 or 3 times. And so when she came out, her mother on the end of the barbed wire saw her and said, and the person said to her, "This has never happened before." She's each one of the survivors. And you saw that Helene Weinrach, she's a stunning woman even now. And she said dancing saved her life, because she was living in false identity. And she went to a dance and was dancing with an officer. And later on, she was found out, and she was going to be executed. And the officer saw this and said, "This is too good for you to be executed. I'm sending you to Auschwitz," where she survived. And so like each of these survivors were amazing. I mean, I can go to the stories of all of them. They're all amazing. We really wanted them to come through their feelings, what it was like for them to have to apply for the money, what it was like. And the stories, it was very much interesting. There was this tension because it was co-funded by the German government. And we were insistent because I think, Irene Weiss talks about her Aunt Rosie, who was rejected. And we have to put those stories in too. You can put the stories into the person who didn't want to share their soul with the German doctor under the original agreement, and who was denied. So we wanted and that was the sort of the beauty of having Roberta, because you had the claims conference and the German government, and Roberta was independent. So she told it as it was, warts and all. You know what I mean?
It's muted. Yeah, no, it was, when Herschel and I screened at some of the films for the film festival. When watching this, I was aware of the claims conference kind of at a distance because my parents were survivors, and I know that they got some compensation over the years, and in my mother's later years, the Circle of Care. I don't know if that's everywhere, if that was just in Toronto. She would go
to different organizations. We found what's interesting is in the last 2 decades, probably, we've seen that as survivors age, it's really important for them to stay at home. So we really pivoted a little bit from individual compensation to also getting funding. And next year, our funding will be almost 800, just over in dollar terms, over $800 million in funding. That's just for home care that we give to Jewish organizations worldwide to provide home care services for survivors to stay in their homes. In addition, we have direct payments. Our budget next year is $1.2 billion. But really, because it's really important for survivors to stay in their home, and we have wonderful partner organizations all over the world. Circle of Care that you mentioned is one of them, but who really are on the ground, who get this funding. In most of America's Jewish Family Services, that is known, but every country has their own, and who really help survivors, because we find that for survivors, institutionalization is especially terrible. Right? It's terrible. It's not good for any elderly, but for survivors, it's even worse. So it's really important to keep survivors in their home.
And no, when she was living totally independently and going, I think it was like once a month to these, it was gatherings pretty much of all of survivors for a lunch and a little program. And it was really important for her. And then later on, when she was living in an assisted living, and somebody from Circle of Care would come and kind of check on her every so often, and she would say, "Oh, I get this or this shower person is from Circle of Care," and it was very important. It was very very valued.
We tailor the programs for every need. There's a wonderful program that I actually ended up taking my daughter to do it. It's in Borough Park, which is an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in New York. And the women there, the survivors, they didn't want to get together for coffee and cake. It wasn't their thing. But they're religious women. So somebody had the idea, a social worker, let's get them to cut up fruit for the local Bikur Cholim, for the hospitals, and put it in the hospital rooms. And the ladies, they wanted to do that because they wanted to do a mitzvah, a good deed. So they come together and they cut up fruit and someone donates the fruit, and they sit there and they cut up the fruit, and then they have coffee, whatever else. And it's a social activity. Some of them, it's the only time they get out. They're all survivors, right? And they get out, and it was really funny. We took the German government there to see how we're using their funds. And the German government, we said to them, and this Hungarian lady says, "Don't just stand there, cut." And she gave him an apron. And this is the deputy finance minister, sitting there chopping out fruit. And then he says, I know we give them a lot of money. Don't you think that you could get them better knives? The knives are a bit blunt. And we said, they're 90-year-old people. We don't want them to have sharp knives. You know what I mean? Anyway, it's like we try and tailor. It's really important to do the home care, which is the bathing and the feeding and the shopping, but also social. It's important for them, for people to get out and have companionship.
Absolutely. As the number of, I'll say, actual survivors diminishes, what do you see as the future for the claims conference? Will the focus be education or something different? Or
well, while the numbers of survivors is diminishing, it's true, those who are alive get older and sicker. So the needs are not I'm not sure if we're at the needs or the plateau. So it's true, because everybody, the younger survivors, are becoming old. So the needs will be there for a significant amount of time. That's true. And then it will drop off dramatically, because at a certain stage, whilst people are dying, there's no one there to replace them in being very sick. But yes, this year we're spending over 30 million. We will be spending by 2027, 41 million euros in Holocaust education, which is already a lot of money. So that's growing, the amount we're spending. Look, unfortunately, the need for Holocaust education is growing too. I mean, it's doubly difficult, because many of survivors, I've been on tours of museums with survivors, and it's a unique experience. And as those survivors are not well enough to do the tours, it becomes more of a challenge.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I'm not sure if I should pivot to this or not. I mean, the whole issue of reparations for the victims of Nazism is, I mean, so important. And in our, certainly American society, the question of US reparations for African Americans and Native Americans keeps kind of coming up and being pushed down and all this. Here, there's so much talk about critical race theory and people who are so afraid to face our history, but it's a concept that Germany has accepted.
I think what I would say about it is the following. I think that compensation in the case of Germany could not have happened without somebody coming to terms with what happened. The two things are intricately related. I'll give you an example. I don't know if many people know about this, what happened during World War II with the Japanese, with what's called the comfort women. The Japanese came through and they used Korean women basically as sex slaves for their army. I mean, I think that's a short way of doing it. And large numbers. We're talking about 250,000 women were used in this way. So, but the Japanese never, there's been a whole tension with Korea about this. And it's not just compensation. It's also the fact that you have to look at yourself. You've got to admit what happened. You've got to look at why it happened. And there's a whole process. The two things they can't happen independently. You can't have the compensation without the coming to terms with it. And I think that, what's really interesting is that if you Google comfort women, you see it's still coming up. This whole issue is still alive today because it really hasn't been dealt with in a proper way in the last 70 years. So my thoughts are that you really have to come to terms with history, right? And then the two things flow together. And without Konrad Adenauer's statement and taking of responsibility in 1951, September 1951, you wouldn't have had negotiations. I mean, the two things are, and the Jewish world wouldn't have negotiated with him without that acceptance of responsibility, right? It works both ways. So I think that's sort of my take on it.
Yeah, I have to say that for me, one of the huge learning pieces from watching the movie was learning about Konrad Adenauer's role. I thought, boy, talk about somebody who's brave and a leader. I mean, clearly the mood in Germany was not, oh, we feel bad about what Germany did to the Jews or anything else. And I mean, I knew his name, but I really didn't know about him. And I came away from it just so impressed, so kind of blown away by him. And I mean, Herschel and I were in Germany in October, and I still don't feel incredibly comfortable when I hear German language and all this, even though, because I speak Yiddish, I can understand a fair bit. But I know in my head how much Germany has done to, I'm not sure if make amends is the right word, but to go a different direction. And are you familiar with Susan Neiman's book, Learning from the Germans?
I've seen it. I haven't read it. Right.
It was amazing because she spends the first half of the book talking about all the things that, I mean, that have happened in Germany to address their guilt, responsibility, And then the second half of the book, she spends time in Alabama and Tennessee and kind of talking about how we could learn from the Germans. It's a worthwhile read in your sort of spare time.
I think it's also, you got to say that Ben Gurion was also, I mean, I think if you would have taken a straw poll in Israel, I'm not sure that he would have won the majority. That if he'd taken a referendum, should we go ahead with this? I'm not sure he'd have. But he, he did what was right for the state. He had a vision of what he had to do. And I think he was sort of also, when you saw the riots in the outside the Knesset, he also, it was such a close vote.
It was by one vote. It was one vote, right? Wasn't it?
Yeah, they brought one person in, was in the hospital. They brought him in on a stretcher to vote. There was another person who was attending his grandchild's wedding who was only allowed to stay at the chuppah and then had to run to the Knesset. I was reading the stories about it when doing research for the film. There was somebody else who was in Paris on some mission, was brought back. You know what I mean? They needed every vote. You know what I mean?
Well, and Begin, who spoke so vehemently against it, but it's so hard. I mean, nobody has a crystal ball to know what's in the future. And
look, I understand where Begin was coming from. I mean, I don't think, and I obviously had a lot of people who agreed with him. And, it's interesting. That's the whole paradigm when you talk about leadership. You have to try and go against the will of the people for what is something of. Well, it was interesting. I was doing this class. I was doing a class. I showed this to a high school in New York City, and we were talking about sort of concept of leadership. And it was a little bit disconcerting when one of the students said, "I'm not sure that in any country today's leaders would do that." And it was really a little bit, I don't know, cynical. Perhaps the students don't, not find that leaders everywhere are, not up to what they used to be. It was interesting. These were 12th graders who were a little bit concerned about when we're talking about leadership, because it's what's interesting is, I think one of the things about compensation, Holocaust compensation and restitution, it's always what I call, it's pragmatism versus principle. For example, when we had in 1990, when the Article 2 agreement came out, they did for a long time, you had to be 6 months in a concentration camp to get the pension. And one of the survivors said to me, "What, 3 months in Auschwitz wasn't enough?" The survivor said to me, "A day in Auschwitz was a lifetime, a week was an eternity. And you have to be there. You have to qualify. You have to graduate after 6 months." But that would have helped 25,000 people. So at the time, we took it and we negotiated it down. But there's always, and it's the same with any program, any leadership. You could stick by your principle. And the original Article 2 agreement had an income limit. And someone said, "No one asked you income when they took you to Auschwitz. What, they're going to ask you income now?" And I understand. So it's always this struggle, like many other topics. This is very much a struggle of where principle and pragmatism have to intersect.
Well, it was, like I say, I mean, I think that the film did an amazing job of demonstrating all that. And I have to say, and bringing in presumably actors along with actual footage, it was really, really well done. What was the I can understand it's not hard to come up with a motivation for the film, but how did the film start? I mean, where was the idea born, and how did it go forward?
I think one of the most things, we wanted two things from what this film could be made in 10 years' time. Except what was driving us now is Ben, but that's it, Ben Ferenc. I think he's one of the stars of the film. I think he's, and as it happened, he passed away. He was already 100 when we did the film, right? And I remember we started thinking about the film December 19. We were working already initial discussions with Roberta in February 20, and then COVID starts. So I said, "Roberta, we haven't done a contract, we haven't done a treatment, we haven't done anything." I said, "Here's some money, go and record Ben," because it's COVID, So we want, and you see Moshe Shoret's son, Yaakov Shoret, who's 93 in the film. He also had passed away since, and the survivors who are in the film, some of them are not in such great shape anymore. So it was very much this was the chance to get some of these people who had these first-hand experience. Bettina Adenauer's in the film, she's also not young, you know what I mean? So it was really we wanted to do the film now whilst we still had the witnesses, basically alive.
Was there anybody you had to convince about doing the film, or was everybody on board? Yes, we need to do this.
On board for doing it. I think there was a question about, initially the film was going to be like 30 minutes. It grew because there was so much more to it that we wanted to add, so many aspects of it. I think there was a little bit of tension within the producing of the film about, about what we were going to say and what was going to be in the film. And but I think I think there's a consensus that most people were sort of happy with how it turned out. We obviously, by doing the acting with the actors, the reenactments, it obviously pushed up the price of the film, but we think it was we think it made it more watchable for young people.
Absolutely.
I think reenactments rather than just talking heads all the time. So I'm not quite sure when you say discussion, there was a little bit of how should we do it? Do you know what I mean?
Well, I thought it was excellent. Neil or Herschel, do you have questions?
This is not directly related to the film, but it's something that I think about because I have helped a local survivor with the app that you have to use to verify that you're alive, to be honest. That's what it is. And every time I help her, every year, I wonder to myself, can someone somehow fake or falsify this? It's just, you take a picture of someone and you enter in some information. I wonder if that's ever been a concern. I also don't know if that's something that's within your purview. It's just, I've always wondered that. And I guess the larger question is, to what extent has the claims conference had to deal with apparent or actual falsification in terms of claims?
There was, first of all, the current program, Panim, takes the person's driver's license and matches it to their thing. So we think there's a very high level of security between doing that match. That's a very sophisticated technology, as opposed to just signing a signature. So we think we have a lot of confidence in that to show that people are alive. So that's it. There has been in the past some instances, but as technology has grown, so has our ability to be able to deal with that.
I will say that I'm not familiar with the app right now, but what I remember from many years back, sorry about our clock, is my parents having to go downtown to the German embassy for their Lebensbescheinigung certificate that said that they were still alive, and there was somebody actually named Karen, if I remember, in New York, who they would write to, who would have to translate things for them. And it was quite a process. And over time, my mother no longer had to, my father had already passed away, I think. I no longer had to go down to the German embassy and could get something notarized at the bank that said, it's still her and she's still alive, which made things a lot easier because parking in downtown Toronto is not easy. And then, walking several blocks to get to the German embassy.
So we used to have those as well. This is what this process, if someone still doesn't have a child or a friend who can do the electronic thing, they can still get the piece of paper. That's still an option. And we have a few people who do that. But most people have somebody they know, or they go to their local social welfare agency who helps. My mother goes to the local Jewish Care in Sydney who helps her. But most people have somebody that can do it. And it's much easier for the survivors to deal with.
Couple of questions in two different areas. First of all, on Holocaust education, if I heard you correctly, it sounded like funding for Holocaust education was one of the early priorities of the claim conference. And I'm wondering who the target audiences were at first and how that's kind of evolved over the years. Is there a global attempt?
So one of the things students? In the early years, when you're talking about the 50s and 60s, it was very much focused on preservation of archives because no one wanted to lose the evidence. I think that was like the sort of the main focus. At the beginning, it really wasn't Holocaust education in those initial years. It was really so much more basic than that, right? Since 1995, we have supported Holocaust institutions throughout the world, and we have professional advisory committees now that on education, archives, research. Now there's 2 in the last year on film and now on social media. These are professionals. The different entities around the world apply for grants from us. And one of the things is we often get people to work together if they're working on the same project. Because we are the one person who everybody comes to, we can get people to work together. And we can also say, oh, this project, is or we can also do it the other way. We can be proactive. For example, we found at one stage there was a lack of materials, Holocaust education materials in Spanish for use in South America. So we actually worked with, and there was actually a university, because Texas does a lot of Spanish-speaking materials, to do that. So sometimes we're proactive in looking for things that we want to do, and sometimes people come to us. And we fund everything from big institutions like Yad Vashem and the Holocaust museums, big museums, or we just funded a new Holocaust museum in Detroit, or big institutions, to we're places in Peru or New Zealand and South Africa that are the only programs in those cities. And sometimes we're doing cutting edge. It's very interesting. We were, until just recently, doing something called, which was interesting, Project Sharaka, which brings to Israel, I don't know if you've heard about Arab leaders in moderate Arab countries. So we're one of the funders of that for their work on Holocaust education. Another thing, there's a new institute up in near Haifa, which will only look at the role of women in the Holocaust. So sometimes we're looking, there's all sorts of sort of interesting things. People come to us for funding. And obviously, a lot of what we do is a lot of Holocaust films that you've seen have got funding from us.
We just watched a presentation by some folks from Sharaka who they were actually in Seattle that we zoomed in with. And it seems like their focus has been on the Abraham Accords countries. Mm-hmm. So is that something that did Sharaka come out of the Abraham Accords and they looked for funding from the Claims Conference, or did the Claims Conference help create Sharaka? Or
no, they came to us for funding. We are one of their funders. They have many funders, and our funding is very limited to things relating to the Holocaust education. So they teach the people who come on a lot of programs. Our funding is for the however many days they spend on the program related to anything to do with the Holocaust. That's what we fund, right? But there's a lot of our hope is to we do a lot of teacher training, especially a lot of non-Jewish teacher training, whatever else. So we're doing we do an interesting program in Rwanda as well. That's a really fabulous program. So places that really no one else is putting, some of the programs, things you've heard of Sharaka. Most people don't even know it. So all
heard of Sharaka since about last week.
Right.
Just sort of turned out.
It's funny.
Do you know if the Seattle Holocaust Center is connected with the Claims Conference?
I'm not sure offhand, but I can find out.
I just because I think
to
they
us
do
all the time for funding, for teacher training, for exhibits, for all sorts of things.
Second question is about the rise of hard right nationalism in Germany, sort of having a resurgence. I don't know how significant it is in the country, but I understand that some people are getting elected to the parliament, and I'm wondering if there's any effect whatsoever on the Claims Conference and the people you're dealing with in Germany because of this.
So when we go to Germany for negotiations, we go usually a day earlier and have meetings with all the political parties except the AfD, which is Alternative for Deutschland, which is the far right party. So amongst the other parties, it's pretty much consensus that they will support the Claims Conference. The AfD going in support, especially in the East, of former East Germany. I say the former East, which is definitely a concern. But at the moment, most of the political parties have undertaken that they won't form coalitions with the AFD. Look, we are, thank goodness, we are highly monitored. We're very transparent. Our budget is significant, as I said, 1.2 billion euros, which is real money, comes to the budget committee, and the AFD sits on the budget committee. So far, nobody has said anything about our budget. But again, I mean, obviously, we've never met them. We don't have any contact with them. But most of the other parties are we have strong relations with all the other parties. And most of them have agreed not to form a coalition with the AFD. Now, having said that, there are elections coming up in the next few months in different states, not federal elections in Germany, but different Länder, different states. And one of them is in a place called Thüringen, which is one of the states in the former East Germany. And that's where the AFD support is probably the strongest. So we'll see what happens there. Look, it's a concern everywhere. You know what I mean? It's really a concern. And look, it makes it very, it makes our need for Holocaust education even more necessary.
Karen, we've covered a lot of territory. I know you've done this many times. Are there other things that you might want to share about the movie, the making of the movie, the consequences of the movie being made, or anything else that we haven't asked you to talk about?
Look, I think it's really, I think there are many broader lessons from the movie, you know, about, and I hope that go beyond the scope of the movie. And I think that was one of the things. I think one of the things that I sort of take out of the movie is, I say, my two aspects of hope. One is, the hope is that really you had, when you think about it, when you think that the Jewish side and the German side sat down 7 years after the Holocaust, there's really a hope that if there's a resolve, people can get together and do something good. So I find that positive. And the other positive thing is, I look at the resilience of the survivors. They're just amazing. And to think of people who, you know, their attitudes to life, to the future, to living, and many of them even to their relationships with today's Germans. We often take Germans government officials to meet survivors, and I always say, just check with that if the survivor really wants to talk to a German. And they usually always do. They're able to see beyond the generation that was passed. And I think there's a lot of hope and strength that you see when you think about some of the underlying things, the underpinnings of the movie. And I think that's a positive thing for everybody of every age.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Neil?
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank both of you for joining for the Q&A. Karen, for your work at the Claims Conference and in supporting this film, and Mary, for your work here in Spokane as well, related to Holocaust remembrance and many other causes within and outside the Jewish community, and Herschel for joining us as well. And I think this will be a really rich supplement to the film for anyone who does view it, and then going forward into the future as well for folks in our community who view it. Maybe we can have an in-person viewing at some point in the future. We always have more films than we're able to show in person during the festival. That doesn't preclude an in-person showing at another time, and we could certainly supplement with this as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And just as I will send you afterwards the links if people want educational material so that you can pass it along. We're happy to do that. Please. And thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, and I really appreciate it.
Wonderful.
Thanks for your work.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Be well.
Right. Take care and have a good rest of the day.